Hello there! This will be a tutorial on how to make thumbnails for Game Builder Garage, as well as how to make them show up in the free programming screen and be invisible or not be seen at all whenever you open the game. So let's begin. So firstly, what determines a thumbnail of a game? Here, thumbnail is basically whatever is on this area of the screen. So basically from the top to the bottom and like make a square of that size in the middle on the second frame of the game. Basically at the start of the game, on the second frame that the game is running, it takes a screenshot of this area and uses that as the thumbnail. Now the first thing we need to deal with is, well, if we have a texture that we're going to use a thumbnail, how do we place our texture at the exact position that we need it? Well, there's a few different things that we can do. Like for instance, we could use the head node on and attach some objects to it and attach the object. For example, here we could do something like that. Attach the object to the in front of the head node on and have this show up. Say it's the center. It's gonna show up there, and like we can adjust this box to move it closer or whatever. That's one way to do it. But if we want to be as efficient as possible, well, we can just grab our raw thumbnail and put it in a very specific location so that we have we have it at the exact position that we want for the thumbnail. So how do you do that? Well, typically we just use trial and error. Like for example, here I just put it at the same X and Y position as the game screen or the camera, and I just like move it backwards and backwards until it's exactly at the right position that we want for the thumbnail. And yeah, you can do that. But here I actually made a cheat sheet for you already for common FOVs and common sizes. So the distance that we need here basically only depends on the FOV and the size of the texture. So we can see here, for example, so right now we're using an FOV of 60 and a texture with a size of 0.8 by 0.8. So if you look at this cheat sheet, you just look at size 0.8 and FOV of 60, we see here 1.23. So what does this number mean? This number is basically the distance that we want our texture to be in front of the camera. So that is that exact position that we need for the texture to be perfectly sized as a thumbnail. So how do we do that here? Well, the first question here is like we have a green screen. What's the position of the camera? Is this the position of the camera? No, this is not. If you're using a game screen, this is not the position of the camera. Well, regardless of what camera scheme that you're using, the easiest way to figure out the position of the camera is just take the head node on and just grab these grab a number object and grab a location sensor. So since the head node on is basically at whatever position the camera is at any time, we can just attach a location sensor to that to basically figure out where the camera is whenever we want to. For example, here we just want to see, we already know the X and Y position of the camera, so it's at X and X0, Y 1.8. Now we just want the Z position, so let's see here what shows up. So it says here, the Z position of the camera is negative 5.81. Now if we look at our table here, in our settings, we want the texture to be 1.23 meters in front of the camera. So let's look at the number again. We have negative 5.81. If we add 1.23 there, we'll get 4.58. Oh, negative 4.58. So we just set this to negative 4.58. And there we go. The texture sensor is just showing up. There we go. Now it shows up exactly at the place that we want. So let's just try it with something else. Like for example, let's try FOV 90. So FOV 90. What position is our head at? see. This here is at negative 3.32. So negative 3.32 plus 0.71. That's negative 2.61. If I did my math correctly, 2.61. And there we go. So yeah, that's basically it. If you're using any of these sizes or any of these FOVs, you just look at here and punch that into your texture and it'll show up. If you're using any values in the middle, you can just like based on these values, you can just guess somewhere in the middle of these two values. For example, if you're using like FOV 30, they're probably somewhere in the middle here. Using a size between these two, using something that was here. One question you might be thinking is, well, what's this size column for? Like, why would you use a texture thumbnail that's 0.1 instead of just using the default 0.8? Well, here's an example of when that will be useful. So for example, here, our texture is at negative 2.61 and it's 0.71 away from the camera. Well, what if there's an object in front of the camera that's closer than 0.71? So here the object is at negative 2.61. So what if I put this at negative 2.8? Well, now this object is right in our face, or this object is in the middle of our texture and our camera. So now the texture is being obstructed. So one way to prevent that from happening, if you have like a game that's like very zoomed in, for example, or there's a lot of objects close to the camera at the start of the game, you can use a much smaller size. And since it's a much smaller size, it needs to be much closer to the camera to cover the same area in your screen. So let's just do this. So let's grab our number object again and our sensor. So where is the head node on again? It's at negative 3.32. So at FOV 90 at size 0.1, it needs to be 0.09 away. So, and if 3.32, that's going to be negative 3.23. So let's put this at negative 3.23. And there we go. It looks exactly the same, but now the texture is much smaller and it's much closer to the camera. So like if there's any object kind of close to the camera, there's less of a chance that it's gonna show up in front of our texture. Yeah, since it's right in front of us. So that's how that's a quick way to figure out how to place your texture in front of the camera for a thumbnail. Now next, let's go through some more interesting stuff, or some visual stuff. For example, you have this thumbnail, like we made this texture, really happy with this texture, but disappointed that when we take the thumbnail and we look at this in game, it looks way too bright than we want, and like it reflects here. What if we wanted this black part to be even more black, even darker? Is there a way to do that? Well, we can make use of something called backface textures. So if you're not familiar with backface textures, here's just an example. So here, let's just show all textures on this object. You can see here, like at the front, you can see it's being shown on the light, but here, for example, the sun is not hitting it, so it gets dark. One trick that we can do is if we make the object invisible and only show the back face of the texture. So let me show this. So like here, if we look at the back, like the texture on the Z plus on the back side of the object, the texture is also darkened. And that's because it's technically inside of the box, so light shouldn't be hitting it. So by default, any texture that's on the back face doesn't get light shine on at it at all. And like, let me show this again. If you show the Z plus, it's gonna get the light shining on it. So with that mechanic, you can kind of make use of it to make darker textures. Like here, for example, we have the same texture, but we now have a much darker color. So if you want to use a darker texture using a backface texture, we would need an object because this only works if textures are connected to objects. And now let's try to use this for our thumbnail. This needs to be at negative 2.61. At negative 2.61. Let me yeah, put it at negative 2.61, but it's not showing up correctly. Why is that? Well, that's because 2.61 is the center of the box. So we want, since this is at the back part of the box, we want to move this even closer to the camera. So since the box is 0.8, the back part is 0.4 meters away, so we can just move this 0.4 meters closer to the camera. So that's going to be negative 3.01. And now we have this much darker thumbnail. And if you didn't see earlier, since this is the back part, like it's reversed by default because you're supposed to be looking at it from the other side. So if you want it to look correctly, you just flip it there and it shows here. Now we have a dark texture. Well, what if we want to combine both characteristics? We want both light colors and dark colors. Well, we can do that by just using two textures. So here, for example, let me just take this original texture and get rid of the dark parts. So if a texture is not connected to any object, by default it will always face the camera and it will also be hit by whatever light's hitting it. So you can just take this and like if you want this to be in front of this dark texture, for example, we can just move it a little bit closer to the camera. So like negative 2.61, let's make it negative 2.62. Put it in this position and see what happens. Now, we have the dark texture at the back and this lighter texture in front. And now we're able to like expand the amount of colors that we have. So now we have light colors in this front texture and dark colors in this back texture. So that's how you can make even more detailed textures if you want it, by using a backface texture and a front lighted texture. And you can see here, you can kind of see the back part of the texture. So if you want to get rid of that, you can just push it even closer. So maybe like negative 2.612. So they're even closer to each other, but yeah, it's still in front of the other texture, so it shows up. And yeah, here you can't see that, you can't notice that there's two textures anymore. So yeah, that's how you make a much more complex texture. Now the next question is, well, okay, we have a thumbnail, shows up here, very cool. Now how do we make sure that it only shows up on the thumbnail and not in the game? Well, the simplest solution is take a counter, set to 1, constant here, and set the range, connect it to our textures. So you can see there, the texture shows up briefly. Like the texture shows up during the viewpoint. You can see the thumbnail. And when you open the game, it only shows up briefly at the start. So why does this work? So I mentioned earlier that the thumbnail is based on what is shown on the screen during the second frame of the game. So a little fun fact about the counters. If a counter has an initial value, during the first frame, it will always output 0. During the second frame, it will start outputting this value. And during the third frame, that's the first frame that it will accept inputs. So what will happen with this setup is During the first frame, this will be outputting 0. During the second and third frame, this will be outputting 1. And on the fourth frame, that's when 1 will go down to 0, and these will be off from then on. So basically, with this setup, we have a signal that is only on during the second and third frames. So there's a 2-frame window where the texture shows up, and one of those 2 frames just happens to be the second frame, which takes a snapshot for the thumbnail. So that's why this setup works. You might be wondering, well, we already have a node on that activates at the start of the game for 1 frame, and that's the onStart node on. So well, if I use this, we still see the node on shows up for 1 frame, but why doesn't it show up in a thumbnail? Well, that's because the onStart node on actually only outputs for 1 frame on the 3rd frame of the game. So since the thumbnail is taken on the 2nd frame of the game, and onStart is just 1 frame too late to be useful for any thumbnail uses. Like for example, well, we can still use the onStart here to activate this counter. Like we're just gonna put like here and use this counter. So what will happen here is on the 3rd frame, it will send a signal here, and then on the 4th frame, the counter will go down to 0. So it's basically the same as here earlier. But like using a constant is cheaper because like I think most games have constants in them. So you can just basically take any constant that you have, like for example you have like constant 80, constant 38. Just take whatever you have in your game, just connect it here. It works because like we set the range here, so yeah, during the 2nd frame and 3rd frame it's gonna active, and 4th frame is just gonna go down to 0 and get capped there. And if for some reason you only have negative constants, that's fine, just connect it here so that yeah, it does the same thing. So that's the simplest solution. And here, yeah, we already have a activate. If you don't count the constant, this is basically already just 1 node on to activate it. So you can't get any better than that. Now the question you might have is, well, okay, can we do any better than this 2-frame activation? Because like maybe you might get annoyed that by the fact that the player gets to see that thumbnail for the start of the game. Well, there's actually a way to get rid of that. And since, yeah, I mentioned earlier that the game takes a snapshot at the 2nd frame. So like you might think it's impossible to make a thumbnail that the player won't see during in-game, but there's actually some few glitches that we can use that can kind of bypass that. So let me just show you a few of those glitches. So here's the first glitch. So this first glitch makes use of a location sensor in set to initial position. So I actually won't go too much into how this thing works. I'll go deep into this glitch on another video. But here, yeah, we'll go too deep into the rabbit hole if I talk about this here. So I'll just show that it exists here, just so that you know that there is an option that we have. So here, basically in this setup, make sure that the location sensor is at the initial position, and like choose an output, make sure that it's not 0. And just set up these 4 node-ons, connect the knot to the texture, and what will happen is, in the free programming screen, you will see that the thumbnail will show up, and when you first enter the game, the thumbnail doesn't show at all. However, whenever you reset, like for example, let's hold plus here, it shows up. And if we go into programming screen and go out again, it still shows up. So with this setup, the thumbnail is only invisible when you enter from the free programming screen. So that's the first glitch. Now there's a second glitch that's actually much better. So for the second glitch, you have a location sensor. So how we activate this glitch is very simple. First, we choose any of these inputs. Let's say let's just take the Z input. Now, once we connect the node-ons here, we need to put or we need to set the location sensor to have that input or that output to be 0. So here it's already 0. And the next step is change it to anything other than 0. So now I just set it to 0.1 and then undo. And that's basically the glitch. So let's show it here. You can see the thumbnail, and when we go in, it doesn't show up. So yeah, let me just show you how easy it is to do. Let me use different inputs, like for example Y. So for Y, we want to set this to 0. Set to 0. Set to anything other than 0. Undo, and now it works. And I'm not really sure why this works. It's a glitch in the game, but yeah. So that's not the only way you can activate the glitch. Like for example, another way you can activate the glitch is, example, let's say here. Another way to do it is, let's say you're taking output Y. You start with a value that's not 0. We grab the node on. We use it to move the screen, like you move the screen in any amount at all. Then set it down at a place where that output will become 0. So here I put it at Y is equal to 0. And then the glitch will activate as well. So that's the invisible texture glitch. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you use that, after activating that glitch, make sure you don't do anything else on the game. Because if you do anything else on the game, the glitch will reset and not work anymore. So here, I did something you can notice here that the thumbnail is no longer there. So I can just activate it again. Or let me try again. Activate it. And then yeah, there it shows up. But when even if I just look at a node on or just move the screen a little, it gets rid of the glitch immediately. So if you're gonna do this, just make sure that this is gonna be the last thing that you do for your game. Now, if you upload your game and like that others play with it, it will be write protected. And it's one good thing, one silver lining is if it's write protected, even when someone opens the game and move the screen around, when they go out while it's still write protected, it's gonna be still preserved. So it only breaks if you open it when it's not write protected, and yeah, open any node on, move anything, or even move the camera. That's when it's gonna break. Now, before I go, here's just a quick discussion on which method you should be using to activate your thumbnail. Well, first let's go through here. So for the initial position location sensor glitch, this setup is basically only useful to you if for some reason you want the thumbnail to show up after the person resets your game, but not show up when they open it from the free programming screen. So if for some reason you want that to happen, something only happen after the first reset or after the person or the player goes into the programming screen and goes back. Otherwise, I don't see much reason to use this setup. Now here, like the most obvious choice here would be to use the location sensor invisible thumbnail trick. It only uses one node on after all. And in addition to that, you can actually save a few more constants with this since you're using a location sensor. Like for example, we can set the position to x equal to 1, y is equal to 2, for example. And we can use the Z input to activate the textures. So like, for example, we need a constant 1 and 2 somewhere else in the game. We can just use the location sensor to send 1 and 2 since the position of the location sensor is not moving anywhere, it's basically constant. And we can just use the Z output to control the thumbnail. So here we have our thumbnail activator plus 2 free constants that we're free to use. So it's basically 3 node-ons in 1. And let me activate it there. You can see thumbnail shows up, invisible thumbnail, and we have these 2 free constants to use. So the location sensor is really robust, really useful because of that. Now, that doesn't mean that you should never use this solution. So what are actually the benefits of this over this solution? Well, for this solution, well, since this counter sends a value at the very start of the game, it's basically a free onstart node. Like for example, if you're using this to activate the thumbnail for your game, you can basically reuse this as if you have an onstart node on using somewhere else. Like for example, here, let's just say I'm using the onstart node on to activate this party popper at the start of the game. We can essentially shave this onstart node on and just use this counter instead if we have anything that we want to happen during the start of the game. So for example here, it's basically the same thing. So if you don't care too much about the invisible thumbnail and you don't think you need the extra constants, but you think you would need to shave that on start instead, then I would recommend using this instead. So that's basically it for this video, and see you in the next one.